Yes, YouTubes, and welcome to The Social Entrepreneur. Today's video is about how to create a pitch for a startup, and this can be used to help you gain, for example, a place on a startup program, a startup grant, or even access finance like a startup loan or a small seed funding investment. Because I mentioned startup loans, one thing that I want to say is never go out there and directly loan initially funding for a startup. So for example, if you believe that you needed £5,000 to start up and get going, simply save up £500, or if you're lucky, apply for and gain a startup grant of £500 and trial and test the initiative at 10%. Run it really lean, and you want to trial and test that because you in effect want to gain proof of concept and hopefully turn £500 into £1,000, and that you know there is a market for your product or your service. Once you know there's a market for your product or service and it works, then you can look at going to gain a startup loan. The reason I say this is because startup loans are usually personally guaranteed, so whether the business is a failure or success, you're going to be liable for paying that back. So always take some time, energy and effort to ensure that if you're liable for something, that you're confident that you can not only repay that, but generate the funds to reinvest in the startup to continue to develop and grow that in the future. This is the way that I pitch for a startup. Only were you pitching and creating a presentation that you needed to present to get on a startup program, to access a startup grant, or to gain some funding like a startup loan or a seed funding investment. Always follow the criteria, guidance or guidelines that the organization sets for you. Within that, you can always be creative and put your own stamp or stance on the presentation itself. I used to manage startup programs that also gave out startup grants. So the way that I now present is a culmination of watching hundreds of individuals pitch to me, as well as across the years me having to pitch to others to go on to programs or to gain startup funding through grants or through investment or through loaning funds. So hopefully this experience that I've gained and the processes that I'll pass on to you about how to create a good pitch for a startup will be useful. But one thing that I will always say is to go out there and listen to others and see how they present and pitch and convey their product or service. You can always take bits and pieces from certain individuals that you like and not necessarily take on board the things that you don't. And over time, you'll adapt and create your own style and way to present your startup to others. So the key to presenting not only pitches, but other business planning documents like a concept overview, a pitch deck, a business plan is to always be clear, simple and concise. When I first started out, I always used to over elaborate, and that was probably because I was fairly young and inexperienced. I now pitch at a level that is a lot simpler because I realise that's what individuals wish to see and wish to hear. The good thing about creating a presentation and a pitch is that that is going to provide you with a structure for you to follow whilst you're presenting your startup idea. So even if you're nervous or anxious about presenting, that structure will allow you to almost go into autopilot, provided you know all the key facts, data and information about your startup and the industry that you're operating in. Within this video, I'm actually going to use a presentation and a pitch to share with you that I've actually used to present to potential collaborators, partners, funders, investors, stakeholders, service users and customers. And I was successful in raising not only investment to create the initial model and platform for this startup concept, I've also since gone on to raise additional investment to look to replicate that in other areas of the UK. So in order to actually pitch a startup, before you get to the stage where you're going to present your concept for your product or service to others, you obviously initially need to do quite a bit of design and development work to allow for this. So ensure that you've done this work before you look to sit down to actually create the pitch. Structure of the pitch itself. So initially you want a cover slide, and on that cover slide you want your brand name, your logo and your slogan. You want your elevator pitch for the business. You also want your name and your contact details like email, number, your website and your business address. The cover slide is really important. You want it to be impactful, to have some good corporate identity, to really represent your startup, your brand and your company. And you really want to start as you mean to go on. In the presentation itself, you might not necessarily present the cover slide to the panel or the investors, for example, but you still want a really impactful initial slide with all of your information in detail on there, so that after you've presented and gone away and they're going to consider whether you gain access to a startup program, a startup grant, a startup loan, or some seed investments, that they've got the details to get back in touch with you in the future, or that they can fully consider your pitch and your proposal because all the information that they need is right there to hand. So the middle slide, and this is the most important one where you're going to put all your content into to present. Be sure to match the branding on the front slide with the middle slide, because you want to keep that continuity running throughout the pitch and the presentation itself. Unfortunately, grant funders, lenders or investors do judge books by their cover. So it's really important that you pay attention to detail and follow the styling throughout the presentation. So on the middle slide itself, there are 10 components, areas that I populate it with information. One is your name and your professional background that outlines the skills, experience and expertise that you've gained. Two is the problem that you're looking to solve, and be sure to include key facts and figures in relation to that particular challenge. Three is the market and the size and spend of that market. But equally, quite often when people start up and launch products or services into the marketplace, they don't launch it into the entire market because of their size, scale and capacity. So they focus on a particular niche within that. So be sure to outline that specific niche as well. Four is a solution, and that solution should be your product or service. Five are the benefits that your product or service offers or looks to create on a commercial level as well as on the social side. Six, speaking about key partners, collaborators, funders, investors, stakeholders, users and customers that you require or you've already got on board to launch your product or service into the marketplace. Seven is your minimum viable product. So what's the minimum scale that you need to launch your product or service into the market in order for it to be financially viable, sustainable, and hopefully generate a profit to reinvest to continue to grow and develop that business. Eight. So eight is the ask of the individuals that you're presenting to. Were it a program, for example, it might be, this is the type of help and support and these are the reasons why I'm applying to you for this program. Were it for grant funding, it might be outlining the amount of funding that you need and breaking down what equipment, facilities and resources that you need to acquire in order to deliver your product or service. Were it for a startup loan, then again it would be itemizing or listing out the key equipment, facilities and resources that you need to launch your product or service. Were it for some seed funding, again it would be listing out what that capital would be used to acquire, or to cover your time to, for example, work full time on the business itself to really grow and develop and scale that initiative. 9, so returns. This would highlight the additional income and expenditure and return on investment, for example, that you could generate with this additional help and support or funding or investment. 10, finally, highlighting what your future plans for the startup are. So within the presentation itself, you would have pitched to create a new product or service, but finally it's really good to sell to the individual that you're presenting to what your future aims, goals, objectives, your overall mission is for the future, so that they hopefully buy into that vision and get involved to offer you some help and support, some finance, so that you can grow and develop your product or service into a great business. Once I've presented in and around those 10 areas, it's then on to the final end slide. On the final end slide again, I brand up and I keep the continuity in terms of how it looks stylistically, so that there's good continuity throughout the presentation. I then thank the individuals that have sat through the presentation, the pitch for the startup, for their time and attention. And then after that, I welcome any questions. Hopefully you've given the individuals that you're pitching to a really good oversight in regards to the startup that you wish to create, and that you've inspired them and made them inquisitive towards the product or service that you are looking to launch. And hopefully they'll have lots of interesting questions for you. On the question side, you need to ensure that you know all the key facts, figures, information, data and statistics in and around not only your product or service itself, but equally the sector or the industry that is looking to operate within. You also need to be able to articulate exactly the way that your product or service operates in its entirety, so that you can show the individuals that you've presented to and are asking questions of you that you know your product or service, your startup, your business inside out. One of the key areas within that as well is to be really on top of the financial side. So really have a good grasp on what your startup costs are and what's within those startup costs themselves, what your expenditure is and all the different components and elements within that and how you've come up with those figures, and then equally what your income is, as well as a breakdown of the cost of your product or service to deliver itself, as well as the profit and the margins within that, in addition to the number or level of product or service that you need to sell in order for the business to not only be sustainable, but to hopefully generate a profit, to reinvest, to continue to grow and develop that initiative into the future. And you want to have a good grasp of all of these areas so that you feel comfortable and confident in presenting to others. So I'm now going to give you an example run through of my pitch for a concept that I developed and managed to gain investment to not only implement and scale, but also additional funds to replicate in the future. Here's the cover slide for that you can take a quick look at. Hopefully that covers all the areas and all the information that I highlighted should be on there. Here is the middle slide, so the main component of the pitch, the presentation itself, with the 10 areas, again, that I hopefully mentioned should be on there. So the initial point covers my name and professional background of being an entrepreneur in residence, a social entrepreneur in residence, a social entrepreneur, as well as being the head of enterprise and entrepreneurship at a university. This provides some context as well as insight to skills, experience and expertise that I've gained to the investors and track records that I've created. I then highlight the problem, which is 300,000 individuals in the UK that live in homeless hostels and shelters. In addition to these 300,000 individuals, there's also another 1 million people, unfortunately, on the social housing register. The problem is that there is nowhere for these 300,000 individuals in homeless hostels to move on to, because there's another 1 million people in front of them who are also looking for social accommodation, somewhere safe to live. So the problem is a lack of move-on accommodation for individuals at risk of homelessness that live in hostels and shelters. I then highlight the market, which is government and local authorities spend £4 billion a year. That's around about £14,000 per individual to house them in homeless hostels and shelters. In addition to this, the individuals in homeless hostels and shelters receive job seekers allowance of around £4,000 a year. So in total, to move someone from the streets into a homeless hostel or shelter costs the taxpayer £17,000 a year. I now move on to the solution, which is the product or service, the startup that I've created that tackles the problem and the issues around that, which is to develop a platform that redevelops unused commercial property, like some of the 15,000 public houses in the UK, to, on the upper floors, create move-in accommodation for individuals who move out of homeless hostels and shelters, and on the ground floor set up a social enterprise initiative like a coffee shop, for example, that can provide on-site access to training, work experience and employment support. I then highlight the benefits to this. The benefits are that these individuals at risk of homelessness are housed in a central location within town or city centres, so they have easy access to all of the help and support and guidance that they need within the local community itself. They also have the on-site access to training, work experience and employment support. So if they're that vulnerable, they don't even need to leave the platform itself to gain the help and support to start to move on with their lives and to live independently. I also highlight that there's a 52% saving to the taxpayer itself, because the model houses individuals at the local housing allowance instead of the rate that homeless hostels, that housing associations or charities run to support homeless individuals. So in effect, were this model to be replicated all over the UK, and the 300,000 individuals that are currently in homeless hostels and shelters housed in this way instead of the way that they currently are, it would save the UK government and local authorities over £2 billion a year. And in addition to that saving, it would ensure that those individuals have easy access to everything that they need to move on and become independent, as well as have on-site access to training, work experience and employment support. So not only housing, but support and work experience and help to gain employment. Finally, I highlight the benefit that within 12 months, the model can take somebody that is costing the taxpayer £17,000 in benefits, and in 12 months, take that individual, support them and train them up so that they can become a barista, for example, in Caffè Nero, Starbucks and Costa, and work full-time within that. And actually, instead of costing the taxpayer £17,000 a year, suddenly they're generating an income of £20,000 plus. I then highlight any key collaborators or partners that I potentially might need to set up the initial platform. So this model and platform partners with charitable housing associations to house and support the individuals at risk of homelessness on the upper floors, as well as partners with local charitable and social enterprise initiatives to run the ground floor to provide the on-site access to training, work experience and employment support. Within this, there's 1,000 charitable housing associations across the UK. There are 180,000 registered charities and around 90,000 social enterprises. After highlighting the number of potential collaborators and partners nationally within the sectors and industries, I then highlight the local partners and collaborators that I've got on board already within those areas that are going to help and support the model itself to be implemented, managed, scaled and even potentially replicated in other areas in the future. I then talk about the MVP, the minimum viable product. So this is 12 units of accommodation on the upper floors to house the individuals at risk of homelessness, as well as have 2,000 square feet on the ground floor to run social enterprise initiatives, like a social enterprise canteen or bar and retail space, for example. I was able to figure out what the minimum viable product was because I initially took some time, put in some energy and effort to financially plan the concept, to figure out that I needed a minimum of 12 units of accommodation on the upper floors and 2,000 square feet on the ground floor to be able to service the lending or investment and give the returns to those individuals or organizations, as well as generate the surplus that was required to reinvest, manage, scale, develop and grow the platform and replicate the model in the future. Then comes the ask. So I'm asking for £500,000 to acquire an unused public house and redevelop that to create the 12 units of accommodation on the upper floors, as well as have the 2,000 square feet on the ground floor to run the social enterprise initiative in. And I can do this either by lending on a commercial mortgage basis, so a 5% interest, for example, over 25 years and reservicing those payments, or taking £500,000 from a commercial investor that would require a minimum of a 10% return on investment per year. I then show the returns of the initiative itself, be that I'm lending the funds and repaying that, or taking the money off an investor and providing the 10% return on investment per year that generally they're looking for. And I do this by highlighting and outlining the incomes and expenditure of the initiative that then also demonstrates that I can not only service the debt but equally still generate a profit to reinvest in the initiative so that it can grow and develop into the future. Finally, I speak about the future plans, which is to set up the initial model, make sure that that's successful, sustainable and generates a good surplus, and then reinvest that surplus in replicating that model in other locations right across the UK. And hopefully that shows to someone that you're obviously focused and have an ambition and goal to start one initiative up, but the vision is to have multiple in the future, and you're looking for partners, collaborators, funders, investors that can support you to help you realize and actualize this. After this, we're then on to the end slide. Again, hopefully you can see that it's branded up nicely and matches the cover slide as well as the middle slide. So you're keeping continuity throughout the presentation so that it looks as professional as it can. It also has the thank you for your time and attention and points out that you welcome any questions now from the panel or the individuals that are listening to you pitch your startup. So I hope today's video on how to create a pitch for a startup was useful for you. Again, like I said earlier on in the video, this is the way that I personally do it. Always pay attention to any guidance or criteria if you are pitching for a startup program or a startup grant or a startup loan or for some seed funding from the individuals, groups or organizations that you're pitching to for that help and support or finance. Also, go and listen to other individuals like me who have presented and pitched and successfully raised funding and investment before, to see the way that actually they structure their pitches and their presentations. Hopefully over time you'll develop your own style, taking the best parts and components that other people use that works for you. Please like, share, subscribe and comment, and I look forward to seeing you in another video. Bye.